The football match that started a real war. 2,000 people died. You are watching a football match. Your team is losing. You are angry. You shout at the screen. You curse the referee. You throw the remote at the wall. Now, imagine that 2 weeks later, your country invades the country that beat you. Tanks roll across the border. Planes drop bombs on cities. 2,000 people die. This actually happened. In the summer of 1969, two small nations in Central America played a football match. Just a qualifier for the World Cup. 90 minutes of sport. But 4 days after the final whistle, the bombs started falling. The war that followed lasted 100 hours. 2,000 people were killed. 300,000 were forced to flee their homes. Two economies collapsed. Two countries were broken for decades. Historians call it the Football War. But the truth is much darker than the name suggests. Because the football was never really the reason. The football was just the spark. The bomb had been waiting to explode for 50 years. This is the story of how a simple game lit the fuse on a forgotten war. A war between two neighbors. A war over land, hunger, and pride. A war that nobody talks about anymore. And a war whose scars are still bleeding today, more than 50 years later. Let me show you how it happened. It is June 1969. Picture two small countries sitting side by side in Central America. On the left, El Salvador, tiny, so small you could drive across it in 3 hours, but packed with people. The most densely populated country in the entire Americas. Almost 4 million people crammed into a piece of land, smaller than the state of New Hampshire. On the right, Honduras, 5 times bigger, almost empty. Mountains, jungle, rivers, farmland stretching for miles with nobody on it. These two countries are neighbors. They share a long border. They share a language. They share a history. They share the same Catholic religion. They eat similar food. They watch the same TV shows. And they share a problem. The problem is land. El Salvador is so small and so packed with people that most families have nothing to farm. And here is the worst part. The good soil that does exist is not owned by the people who work it. It is owned by 14 rich families. Yes, 14. These families own the coffee plantations. They own the cotton fields. They own the sugarcane. They own the banks. They own the newspapers. They even own the army. These families are called La Catorce, the 14. For everyone else in El Salvador, life is desperate. You wake up before sunrise. You work in someone else's field for almost no money. You go home to a one-room shack. You eat beans and tortillas. Your children do not go to school. Your wife is sick. There is no hospital. This is life for most Salvadorans in 1969. So, what do you do when your country has no room and no food? For decades, poor farmers from El Salvador crossed the border into Honduras. They walked. They carried their tools on their backs. They brought their children. They cleared empty land in the Honduran jungle. They built homes from wood and tin. They planted corn. They planted beans. They built small churches. They started schools. They lived quietly. By 1969, around 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras. That is 1 out of every 8 people in the entire country. The Hondurans were not happy. Their own poor farmers were angry. They said the Salvadorans are stealing our jobs. They are taking our land. They are crowding our markets. They are filling up our towns. They speak our language, but they are not us. They are foreigners. They do not belong here. The government of Honduras agreed. The Honduran economy was failing. Prices were rising. Jobs were disappearing. Politicians needed someone to blame. They could not blame the rich. The rich were their friends. They could not blame the Americans who controlled their banana industry. So they blamed the Salvadoran immigrants. The perfect target. Poor, foreign, voiceless. In January 1969, the Honduran government passed a new land reform law. On paper, it sounded fair. It said that unused land would be given to poor Honduran farmers. But the law contained a hidden clause. It said that all land owned by foreigners would be taken back first. This meant the Salvadoran immigrants. Salvadoran farmers were ordered to leave the land they had cleared with their own hands, land they had farmed for 20 years, land where their children had been born. Many refused, so the Honduran military came. Many Salvadorans were beaten, some were killed, their farms were burned, their crops were destroyed, their animals were stolen. By May 1969, refugees were pouring back across the border into El Salvador with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Salvadoran newspapers exploded with horror. They printed photos of burned villages. They told stories of women attacked, children murdered, old men beaten to death, pregnant women losing their babies on the long walk home. Were all the stories true? No. Some were exaggerated. Some were invented to sell newspapers. Some were planted by the Salvadoran government to stir up rage. But they worked. The stories made people angry. Very, very angry. And here is the thing about anger. Anger needs a target. Anger needs a name. Anger needs an excuse. That excuse came from football. In June 1969, El Salvador and Honduras were both trying to qualify for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. To get there, they had to beat each other, 3 matches. Whoever won 2 of them would go to the World Cup. The other would go home in shame. The first match was set for June the 8th in the capital of Honduras, a city called Tegucigalpa. You have to understand something. By the summer of 1969, the rivalry between these two countries was already at boiling point. The hate was thick in the air, you could feel it. The football match was not just a football match, it was a war waiting for a uniform. The Salvadoran team arrived in Tegucigalpa on the evening of June 7th. They were taken to a hotel near the stadium. The hotel was already surrounded. Honduran fans had been gathering since the afternoon, thousands of them. They surrounded the building, they threw rocks at the windows, they beat on metal sheets with sticks. They set off firecrackers under the windows. They shouted, they sang, they screamed insults. They blew whistles, they banged on car horns. All night, the Salvadoran players did not sleep, not for one single minute. Some tried to lie in bed, some sat on the floor, some prayed. The team doctor handed out sleeping pills, but the noise was too loud for any pill to work. When the sun came up, the players were ghosts, pale, shaking, their eyes red, their hands trembling. The coach told them to eat breakfast. Many could not. That afternoon, they walked onto the pitch in front of 50,000 screaming Hondurans. They could barely run. Honduras dominated the match. The Salvadorans defended desperately, but they had no energy to attack. Minute after minute, Honduras pushed forward. The match was still scoreless in the final minute, and then in the 90th minute, a Honduran player named Roberto Cardona scored. 1-0. The stadium exploded. Fireworks lit up the sky. Fans poured onto the pitch. The match was over. And then something terrible happened. In a small town in El Salvador, an 18-year-old girl named Amelia Bolaños was watching the match on television. She was the daughter of a humble family. She had black hair, she had dark eyes. She loved her country with all her heart. When Honduras scored that final goal, she did not cry, she did not shout. She stood up calmly. She walked into another room. She opened a drawer in her father's desk. She took out his pistol. She returned to the living room, and she shot herself in the heart. She left a note. In careful handwriting, she wrote that she could not bear to see her country humiliated. She wrote that she was dying for El Salvador. She was 18 years old. The next morning, Amelia Bolaños was on the front page of every newspaper in El Salvador. By the afternoon, she was a national symbol. By the evening, she was a martyr. Her funeral, 3 days later, was unlike anything El Salvador had ever seen. It was televised on national television. The streets were lined with mourners. The president of El Salvador himself walked behind her coffin. Generals walked beside him. The entire national football team walked in the procession, wearing their uniforms, with black armbands on their sleeves. They had flown back from Honduras just for this. The army gave her a full military funeral. Soldiers fired rifles into the air. A bugler played the last call. The Salvadoran flag was draped over her coffin. The whole country watched. The whole country wept. And the whole country burned with rage. This was no longer about football. This was about honor. This was about a young girl. This was about every Salvadoran farmer beaten in Honduras. This was about every burned village. This was about every refugee child. This was about everything that had been swallowed for 50 years. 1 week later, the second match was played in El Salvador. The Honduran team arrived in San Salvador. The Salvadoran fans were waiting for them. What happened next was revenge in its purest form. The Salvadorans did to the Hondurans exactly what had been done to their own players. They surrounded the team hotel. They threw stones at the windows. They smashed the windshields of the team buses. They screamed all night. They blew car horns. They lit fires in the street. They burned the Honduran flag. The Honduran players were terrified. Some of them cried. Some of them prayed. They were taken to the stadium the next day in armored military vehicles. Soldiers with rifles surrounded the buses. Inside the stadium, 60,000 fans were screaming. When the Honduran team walked onto the pitch, the noise was deafening. The Honduran flag was burned again, right there in the stands. In its place, the Salvadorans raised a dirty old kitchen rag and waved it in the air. The Honduran national anthem was drowned out by jeers, whistles, and insults. The match itself was a slaughter. El Salvador won 3-0. But that is not the worst part. After the match, the violence began. Honduran fans were attacked in the streets of San Salvador. Their cars were burned. Their hotels were trashed. 2 Honduran fans were beaten to death in the parking lot of the stadium. Many more were hospitalized. The Honduran team was rushed out of the country in army trucks, escorted to the border like fleeing prisoners. When the news reached Honduras, the country exploded. Now the Salvadoran immigrants living in Honduras were in mortal danger. The same families who had farmed quietly for 20 years were now hunted. Mobs roamed the streets. Houses were set on fire. Doors were kicked down. People were dragged from their beds in the middle of the night. Some were murdered in their kitchens. Some were beaten in the village squares. Children were separated from their parents. Old people were left to die in burning homes. Many fled into the jungle with only the clothes on their backs. They walked for days through the mountains. They drank from rivers. They ate raw corn from the fields. They carried their children on their shoulders. In just a few days, more than 100,000 Salvadorans were running for their lives, trying to reach the border before the mobs reached them. The two governments cut diplomatic relations, but there was still one more football match to play. It was a tiebreaker. One match would decide who went to the World Cup. The location had to be neutral. Both countries refused to play in the other, so FIFA chose Mexico City. A safe place, a peaceful place, or so they thought. The date was June 27th, 1969. Salvadoran and Honduran fans traveled to Mexico City. They filled the stadium. The Mexican police had to separate them with a wall of armed officers, riot shields, helmets, tear gas ready. The match went into extra time. The score was 2-2, and then in the 101st minute, a Salvadoran player named Mauricio Pipo Rodriguez scored. 3-2. El Salvador had won. They were going to the World Cup. In the streets of Mexico City, fights broke out between the two sets of fans. Hundreds were arrested. Some were stabbed. Several were hospitalized. The Mexican police struggled to keep order through the night. But the real war had not even started yet. That same day, El Salvador officially cut all diplomatic ties with Honduras. The Salvadoran president stood before the cameras. He said that the human rights of Salvadoran citizens in Honduras had been destroyed. He said that something had to be done. He said that El Salvador would no longer stand by while its people were murdered. What he meant was this: we are going to war. For 2 weeks, both armies prepared. Tanks were moved to the border. Old American warplanes were rolled out of hangars. Some of them were Mustangs and Corsairs from the Second World War. Salvadoran pilots painted their planes in fresh colors. Mechanics worked through the night, fixing engines that had not flown in years. Soldiers were given old rifles, some of them rusted, and sent to dig trenches along the border. This was not a modern war. This was a war of leftovers, old equipment, borrowed weapons, untrained soldiers, many of them teenage boys with no idea what they were doing. But it was still a war, and in war, people still die. On July the 14th, 1969, El Salvador attacked. Salvadoran planes crossed the border at sunset. They flew low over the Honduran countryside. They bombed the main airport in Tegucigalpa. They wanted to destroy the Honduran Air Force on the ground before it could fight back. The plan almost worked. Most of the runways were cratered. Several Honduran planes were damaged before they could take off. At the same time, Salvadoran soldiers crossed the land border. They moved fast. Within 2 days, they had captured several towns inside Honduras. They marched deep into Honduran territory. The Honduran army was caught completely by surprise. But Honduras hit back hard. The Honduran Air Force was bigger and better. They had more planes, better trained pilots. They struck Salvadoran oil depots near the coast. They burned the fuel storage tanks. Massive black smoke rose for miles. They cut off El Salvador's supply of gasoline. Salvadoran tanks ran dry. Trucks stopped moving in the middle of the road. Soldiers were stranded with no fuel, no food, and no way home. The whole invasion ground to a halt. And then the world stepped in. The Organization of American States demanded a ceasefire. The United States stopped selling weapons to both sides. International pressure built fast. After only 100 hours of fighting, both countries agreed to stop. 100 hours, just over 4 days. But in those 4 days, 2,000 people died. Most of them were civilians. Most of them were Hondurans living in border villages that had been bombed, shelled, or burned to the ground. Old men, women, children. People who had never seen a football match in their lives. Now let us look at the real cost of those 4 days, because the bombs stopped falling on July 18th. But the war did not end. It just changed shape. First, the refugees. Around 300,000 Salvadorans were forced to flee Honduras. They lost everything. Their farms, their homes, their savings, their tools. Some had lived in Honduras for 30 years. Some were born there. They were now homeless in a country that could not feed them. El Salvador, already the most crowded country in the Americas, suddenly had 300,000 new mouths to feed. The refugee camps became permanent slums. Disease spread. Children died of hunger. Many of these families never recovered. Second, the economy. Trade between the two countries stopped completely. Before the war, El Salvador had sold its goods to Honduras. Cloth, shoes, medicine. Now that market was gone. Honduras stopped buying anything from its neighbor. Salvadoran factories closed. Workers lost their jobs. The Central American Common Market, an organization meant to help all 5 Central American countries trade with each other, collapsed. The whole region became poorer. It took 20 years for trade to fully recover. Third, the politics. Both governments became more corrupt. Both armies became more powerful. In El Salvador, the military used the war as an excuse to crack down on anyone who criticized them. In Honduras, the dictator strengthened his grip. The crowded slums of El Salvador, now bursting with returning refugees, became the breeding ground for something much worse. Poor young men with no land, no jobs, and no hope began to listen to revolutionary voices. Within 10 years, El Salvador exploded into a brutal civil war that killed 75,000 people and lasted 12 years. Many historians believe the football war was the first crack in the dam. The pressure had to go somewhere. After 1969, it went into civil war. Fourth, the football. El Salvador went to the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. They played 3 matches. They lost all 3. They did not score a single goal. They went home humiliated. The price of that World Cup ticket was 2,000 lives. And the deepest wound of all. The two countries did not sign a real peace treaty until 1980, 11 years after the bombs stopped. And the border dispute that had started the whole crisis, it was not fully settled until 1992. 23 years to clean up the legal mess from one football match. But the human wounds never fully healed. Even today, more than 50 years later, you can find old people in El Salvador and Honduras who refuse to speak each other's name. Families separated by the violence of 1969, never reunited. Some are still looking. Now here is the question. Was the war really about football? No. The war was about land. The war was about poverty. The war was about 14 rich families who owned everything in El Salvador while millions starved. The war was about Honduran politicians who needed a scapegoat. The war was about decades of resentment that had nowhere else to go. The war was about the failure of 2 governments to take care of their own people. The football just gave it a name. The football just gave it a stage. The football just gave it permission to begin. If those 3 matches had never been played, would the war still have happened? Probably yes. Maybe later. Maybe in a different way. But the tension was already there. The hate was already there. The fuel was already poured. The football just lit the match. This is something we forget when we watch football today. We watch a match, we get angry, we shout at the referee, we curse the other team, we post insults online, and then we go home, we sleep, we move on. But for some people, in some places, in some times, football was never just football. It was a flag, it was a fight, it was a wound that would not close. In Central America in 1969, the wound was already deep, and one football match was enough to open it. So the next time you watch your team lose and you feel that fire rising in your chest, remember this story. Remember Amelia Bolaños, the 18-year-old girl who died for a goal scored 500 miles away. Remember the burning villages along the border. Remember the children who walked through the jungle with nothing. Remember the 2,000 who never came home. Football is the most beautiful game in the world. But it can also be the most dangerous. Because it does not just show us who we are, it shows us what we have buried. It shows us what we have hidden. It shows us what we cannot say in any other way. And sometimes, when the final whistle blows, the war is only just beginning.
Thank you for watching.
Subscribe.